So, hello, my friends. This is part two of our module on the unconscious. I'm going to talk about the mechanism of repression a little bit. One of the main things about repression is from a physiological point of view, we understand that it always takes work to repress. And when we see stagnation on the pulse, there is always a flow that's trying to happen that's meeting a resistance for whatever reason. And pathogens are in the way. And those pathogens can be external, wind, cold, damp, heat, dryness, fire, for instance. And those pathogens can be internal, which is a fixation on emotion and a fixation on thought. Of internally framing thought is framing the context of events in our lives in a compensatory way that usually has some degree of truth, but often a minimal degree because it happened when we were very young and the mind was in its formative stages and not fully developed. So the perspective is very partial, and yet we draw conclusions about who we are, how others are, how life is, the meaning of things, and frame them in a way that forms the overall context for the assimilation of all future experience, always putting another brick in the wall. So repression takes work. The life force is ultimately an irrepressible force and will break what is ever in the way, whatever obstacle is put in the way of it. But unfortunately, that can be an arterial wall or an organ system. When the volcano finally explodes and neoplasms manifest or a stroke or a heart attack occurs. So again, and we want to promote communication, and communication means the cessation of repression, and the cessation of repression implies the liberation of vast amounts of energy that had gone into repression can now be channeled into healthy physiological relationship between, metaphorically, the officials and the organ systems inside of ourselves, which is reflected in an increased and healthier and more wholesome quality of relationship to our environment in terms of resistance to external pathogens and to culture. And culture can be an external pathogen of warped and twisted ideas. Internal basis of pathology physiologically is related through genes, and the gene is a unit of genetic transmission. And in culture, through memes, which are a unit of transmission of values. It is important to realize that repression is never selective, that as soon as that repression is a lie we tell ourselves. We're doing physiological work to hold down content from consciousness. And the friction between that content and the rising life force attempting to bring it into self-awareness is displaced into symptoms, gross physical symptoms, subtle psychological symptoms, and subtle and not so subtle distortions of the soul. which manifest as twisted and manipulative, dysfunctional and codependent relationships to both ourselves and to others, the proof of which is the degree of negative karma and pain and unnecessary suffering being caused both within and without. When we tell one lie to ourselves, we have to tell another lie to cover that lie and another lie to cover that lie. And soon we've dug ourselves into a deep hole and we actually believe the web of lies in a way that's unquestioned. And that's how much of the dysfunctional dimension of the superego is programmed into us by culture. So again, there's a part of the superego that is the do's and don'ts and shoulds and shouldn'ts. That's healthy. It is bad to rape people, and it is bad to steal, and it is good to stop at red lights. Look two ways when you're entering the streets. There's some settled law here. So there are some culturally transmitted values which stand the test of the ages, which were settled thousands of years ago by the leading realizers of the axial age, 700 to 700 BC to 300 BC or whatever the exact dates of the axial age are, during that formative period where the major traditions arose. So repression is a lie we tell ourselves. The foundational lie is I'm separate, I'm superior, and I'm alone. And we can understand the specific nature of the lie through looking through a constitutional lens. And the constitutional lens, water, wood, fire, earth, metal, tell us the kind of constructs a person has, the kind of thoughts they're addicted to, the kind of emotions they're hypnotized by and entrenched in, the kind of thought, feeling, emotion, and sensation, and the quality of it, and the seasonal and the weather influences in the time of day, and the kind of constructs a person will have and how they'll tend to manifest that in their body through understanding constitutional dynamics and compensations, which are part of the constitutional dynamic. Repression shows up on a continuum from active, outright denial to conveniently just forgetting things. And, I have had an experience where a family member related to me when I was in my late 50s, something that happened when I was 10 years old. And I was completely stunned and shocked. And for a short amount of time in denial of it. Completely stunned. I'd completely and utterly forgotten that this thing had happened in my family. And they told me about it, and I was stunned, and I was like, no, come on, I'd remember that. And it took time. It took months for me to start to get an intuition in the direction of it. And it took several years for a specific concrete memory to emerge of it, to emerge. And then I realized that I was 10, I had an immature mind. What happened, happened. And I remember being uncomfortable and uneasy about it for like 40 seconds. And then I can remember sitting there and my mind was on to the next thought. And I didn't think about it again between the age of 10 and like 47 years, 48 years went by. So there's this forgetting, but it's still there. It's still there. It's deep. And it's at the root of a lot of dynamics and needs to be faced and within oneself, and then hopefully healthfully in the context of whatever relationships were involved in the situation and looked at from the empowered and unvictimized place of the dimension of the self that has had another 30, 40, 50, 60, 70 years of life experience. So we can understand the diaphragm as the wall between the unconscious and consciousness. Everything beneath the diaphragm is unconscious. Everything above it is conscious. And what's above it are the heart, which is the sun, and the lungs, which are the moon, and the 7 holes in the head, the sensory orifices, which are the Big Dipper. And the moon, the stars, the sun are the Chinese character for Shen, which is spirit, which is mind, and which ultimately means as well consciousness itself. So we can understand the diaphragm as an organ of repression. Opening the diaphragm in my teaching is a significant part of treatment, and you can read about that in the herbal chapter of clinical practice on Bancha Hoputang and Bancha Sheshantang, and then in depth in the wood and the metal element in my deepening perspective books. I believe I've assigned all that in the homework. So you can just generally note those chapters, but I believe I've given you specific page references in the notes. So the diaphragm demarcates the upper and lower, and of course Daimai does as well. So opening Daimai can be important. And we can understand the replication of this separation at the ankles, the knees, the hips, the belly buttons, CV 14, 15, at the diaphragm, at the heart, at the throat, at the mouth, at the eyebrows, and ultimately at the top of the head. And I have another table and I have another chart for you coming up elaborating these. So this repression creates stasis at different levels of the body, and those levels of the body correspond to stages of development, and they correspond to point combinations along corresponding to the chakras, which I've given you just above here, CV1, 8, 12, 15, 17, 22, and GV20, but also with points on Renmai, Dumai, and Chiangmai. And the appendix of my green book points to a whole other book that should be written that I could write, which would take me 5 or 6 years that I'm not going to write. But all the work is laid out in the appendix of the green book, pointing the way toward a deeper and deepening Chinese physiology that accounts for evolution through states and state experience and stage, waking up and growing up. So repression results in shadow, and shadow results in allergy and addictions. And these are typified by being triggered by certain content. And a person is triggered by content. The degree to which a person is triggered exists in exact, precise proportion to the amount of energy being done to repress the content that they are not seeing in themselves, but triggered by when it occurs outside of them by someone else or by an organization or some social structure. So, to the degree work is being done within to hold something down, an aspect of self that a person won't acknowledge is part of themselves, then when it's embodied externally, the amount of energy gets triggered and is released, but instead of taking responsibility for it, the person projects it on the thing that's being triggered in a way that makes them a victim, that results in them lashing out and trying to hurt the person or thing that they see as victimizing them. And this is perpetuates the whole cycle of pain and trauma and karma. So when we talk about repression and we talk about resolution of early shadow, we're generally talking about the first four chakras. I have the first three here. The first chakra is survival. It is reflex, like a 2-month-old infant can't initiate movement by will. You clap and they just shudder. They hear a loud noise and they shudder. Everything is reflex. The eyes are still learning to focus. There is no other until about the 3rd month of life, when the ears begin to focus, the eyes begin to focus, and they start to have a sense of other, and when other is missing. And the first other is nipple and breast. And then as the eyes focus more, mother itself. And where there is other, the Vedas tell us, where there is other, there is fear. And fear relates to survival. And the first chakra is reflexive survival instinct and a pervasive anxiety about survival. The second chakra is sexual. It's the magic stage of development. It's instinctual. It's instinctual as opposed to just reflex. It's working on instinct. When a turtle is born and they walk toward the ocean, they know which way to go. The turtles here, I see the giant snapping turtles out in the field across a 2-lane road, 200 feet from the water they live in, laying their eggs. And those eggs are going to hatch, and those baby turtles are going to get out and crawl right toward the water. And that isn't reflexive. Reflexive is spontaneous action to an input. It's instinctual. They're driven. And the second chakra is all about driven by instinct, and that main instinct, the reflexes to survive, but how do we survive? Through sexual reproduction. And whereas the first chakra has a pervasive anxiety, the magic stage of development is immersed in fantasy and can't tell the difference. There's no difference whatsoever between waking and dreaming. Now, I would say dreaming is every bit as real as waking, just more subtle, that the objects in dreams exist, but they're more subtle, vastly more subtle, but still existing. But I'm still aware of the difference between them. But in the magic stage of development, there's absolutely no difference between the two. And the third chakra is the imperial stage of development. It's impulsive. 2 to 4-year-old temper tantrums. Buy me the friggin' dolly, or I'm ruining the family vacation. I want it, and I want it now, and I won't take no for an answer, and I don't care about the consequences, which is why parents have to say, stop. Before you go into the street, look both ways before you get your ball, because the child is impulsive and their impulse is my ball now, want. And they're not aware of any greater consequences for others or for themselves for any of their actions. So at the time they start to have upright motor skills and they begin to act on impulses, they're beginning to gain language, and no parents talk to a 3-month-old trying to teach it anything. You don't tell a 3-month-old, I wish you'd wet your, it's important not to wet your diaper. You understand that everything's reflexive. They don't have a mind to talk to yet. But the impulsive stage of development, the child has some basic language to ask about what they want and to communicate basic needs, even if it's just this, that, want, hungry, basic language. As they begin to speak, we begin to speak to them, telling them what's acceptable, what isn't. And at this early stage, the earliest, most gross level emotions are present, and these are rage and lust. So the fourth stage of development is above the diaphragm. These are the first three below. And the fourth stage is membership consciousness, where the patient is the person, the human being is not an individual. They understand themselves primarily as members of a group, living by rules that were laid down as criterion of the minimal requirements it takes to be part of that group. And the worst thing that could ever be happen would be to lose that group. And that's the age of development you are at, when the most important thing to you is being in the clique, having the same sneakers as your friends, the same bicycle, the same color bicycle, liking the same music. And you're painfully aware of who is in and who is out. And there is only them and us. And I remember going to my 10th high school reunion and being aware of those structures being still slightly in place, and being so impressed at the 20th high school reunion that they were gone. And we were all just people interested in each other, and people that I'd been in cliques with when we were kids. I realized, God, we have nothing in common. And other people, we'd talk, what have you done the last 20 years? And all of a sudden there was a kind of connection there, but we all had a shared history, and the pretense had dropped away. And that pretense is pride, and it's commensurate with the insecurity of people becoming, but who have not yet become, self-actualized egos. Because one of the great values of an authentically self-actualized ego is 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 holding the context that everyone has the right to and should become a self-actualized ego. So getting triggered is that there's unresolved contradictions in these first four chakras. Most uh, most people, meaning more than 50% of people in Chinese medicine, are at least at a postmodern stage of development, which is, top of the heart to bottom of the throat chakra. And all about speaking up for speaking one's truth, right? So let's say at least bottom of the throat chakra. And a lot of people are just in that and haven't healthily consolidated it. So a lot of the work, my expertise is in helping people consolidate postmodernism, transcend it into holistic, helping people consolidate holistic and transcend into integral, and then bringing people into integral, helping consolidate that, and helping people take the first step into the transpersonal stages. And my work is proportionately that, most of which is dealing with and working with people at postmodern or near postmodern stages of development, helping them make what has been described as a momentous leap into second tier. These are the reflections of diaphragmatic repression, also contingent in part on daimai. and separation between consciousness and unconsciousness. And that repression can resonate at ankles, knees, groin, navel, diaphragm is the main area, solar plexus, heart, throat, mouth, third eye, and then ultimately with a pressure and vertex headaches and pressure at the top of the head. Here are the dynamics of repression. So an insight I had when I had my major awakening experience in 2001. I remember just getting up off the meditation pillow, and so much hit me at once and over the next 6 weeks. But in the first 72 hours, it was insight after insight. And one of my insights was from the perspective of liberated consciousness, 99% of all metabolic resource goes to repression, the maintenance of boundaries to sustain the illusion of the separate self sense. And that when liberation becomes real and stable and one significantly ceases repression, all that energy that went into maintaining this boundary to keep attention just fixated on the sense of being a separate, independent, and superior self, the superiority manifests through pride in a way that deprecates, that inflates and deflates everything around one. And we inflate others to inflate ourselves. So it's easy to understand how pride would cause us to deflate others, but the ego inflates others for the sake of self-inflation. I remember when I did Taekwondo, everybody thought that their teacher was the national champion. Their teacher was the world champion. Their tradition, their style was the best. And you see the same thing in Chinese medicine. You see the exact same thing, and you can see it all as a factionalism that creates superficial, artificial, hard boundaries that makes me and mine. My teacher's great, which implies that I'm great because I have the intelligence and the capacity to be close and study with such a venerated person. And on it goes. So, you know, excessively inflating and deflating is a sure sign of shadow and distortion, gross distortions and contradictions at lower stages of development that are impeding the healthy consolidation of leading edges. So here we simply have on the left, on the right, we have the rising life force, which is eros, sexuality, consciousness, yang, pushing its way up the spine to realize ever more nuanced and increased and greater capacities with higher and higher and higher and more inclusive views that grant the ability to cognize greater and greater complexity and respond to it with greater care and compassion, insight and nuance, quicker and quicker and quicker, with less and less conflict and deliberation about it, with greater and greater and greater spontaneity, needing less and less and less time to think and to ponder and to need to be ready to do the right thing. There's a less and less time between the perception of a pure impulse, a pure motive, and acting on it. Until we get to a point where the only moment we ever have now, and we have an unrepressed relationship with the unconscious, so that in real time, as a pure motive arises in awareness, we can give ourselves into it and act in an unself-conscious way spontaneously without reflecting on the necessity to have to maintain the status quo, or how difficult it might be, or what the implications are for me, the personal ego, because we can just see that this action is just going to develop the soul, create greater depth, more integrity, and a more wholesome context for everything and everyone involved. And there's just less, and the ego just needs time, time, time. How much time? Well, sometimes lifetimes and lifetimes. I'm not ready yet. I'm not ready yet. So here we have the rising life force bringing content and full self-expression into the moment. And here we have the frame of the mind doing work, which is the yang organs, thought, how we think about things, and the yin organs, emotion, just repressing, 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 trying to maintain the status quo. And the conflict between the descending force of resistance and repression and the ascending life force creates stagnation and heat, which consumes fluids, which makes things dry, inflamed, and painful, and creates stagnations. And those stagnations ultimately give rise to deficiencies or enhance constitutional deficiencies through depleting resources, because when there's stasis, the body tries to move it and overworks. And then when it overworks, it draws on resources, and those resources of yin yang, qi, and ultimately jing and blood are depleted. And this results in signs and symptoms. And those symptoms are physical symptoms in the body, first subtle. So on the pulse, they're the presence of pathological relationships at a +1 to +2. At a +3, they're starting to become grossly manifest. At a 4, they're certainly grossly manifest and will probably be caught by Western diagnostics. And at a +5, that means they're there and they'll absolutely be caught by Western diagnostics. And they're there and they're gross pathologies at this point. 1 or 2, they're still functional pathologies. 3, they're starting to become embodied. 4, they're embodied and likely to be caught. And 5, they're going to show up on the MRI or the CAT scan or the Holter monitor or whatever it is. They can't be missed at a 5. So there's a force, and that force then can't express itself in the world through speech, through behavior, through being seen by consciousness and integrated and processed by consciousness. So it's displaced into sign and symptom. And then the degree of work that's being done to repress the content, when it's exposed to it outside of itself, explodes as hostility for that which is triggering the liberation of that which one is working to keep from consciousness. And then that explodes into the world as lust, as rage, as anger, as lashing out in some way that causes pain. We're now going to differentiate aspects of consciousness that are related to the unconscious but aren't purely unconscious. The unconscious is everything you don't know. You don't know it. You absolutely don't know it. If you know it, then it's not unconscious. Now we're going to talk about the subconscious. We're going to talk about what's pre-conscious, and we're going to talk about endoceps. So with the subconscious, we can see the dynamic tension between content trying to arise and the person suppressing it as opposed to repressing it. Repressing means something is shoved beyond consciousness. It is hidden from the self by wind, cold, damp, phlegm, heat, or fixation on emotions or thoughts. Obsession with emotions and thoughts. Consciousness is so identified with an emotion or thought that the complex, the miasm of that emotion, thought, feeling, and sensation defines the reality that consciousness is stuck in, and yet is solely perpetuated by the investment of consciousness in it. The more consciousness we put in it, the more real the structure becomes. The more real it becomes, the more we invest in it. And it's off to the races in a runaway train so that the person experiences themselves as having no free will, of having no choice. And, and then they use words like can't, couldn't, impossible, and they start to speak in absolutes about themselves and in absolutes about people, turning people into my dad is a tyrant, my mother is a witch, my wife is a whore, my husband is a hero, my partner is a saint. They're speaking in archetypes and they're talking in absolutes, and it becomes apparent they're stuck in cosmic grooves, playing out deep grooves cut in consciousness, attributing the happenings of their life as support for the thesis that this is the way things are. But they're just playing out Shakespearean dramas in their lives that are universal and appending the hapstance of their lives to them as if the things that happened actually are responsible for the rut that they're in, when actually they're just playing out a drama that's played out all over the world and has been for tens of thousands of years anyway. So the subconscious content appears to consciousness explicitly, and not incognito. The person knows that content, but they just are, they're not repressing it, they're suppressing it, they're playing whack-a-mole with the content, forcing it. It's the leading edge of the unconscious trying to emerge. So when you know, I really should make amends with this person, I really should apologize for this, or that person hurt me, and I really need to communicate to them about it. You're not unconscious about that. But when you take that and you don't honor it and you don't act on it and you just keep shoving it down, and every 3 weeks or every 3 years or every 3 decades, it manifests in, oh, there that is again. Yeah, I remember that. I remember that. I remember that. I can remember, and we'll talk about this in the class on the authentic self. I can remember being 13, 15, 17, 18, 20, and having the realization in a moment of crystal clarity that I could live up to all the very parts of myself and lead a divine life. That I could stop the conflict with my parents, I could stop the conflict with my sister, I could have integrity with all my friends, which would mean having to tell the ones who had hurt me and apologizing to the ones that I had hurt, that I could do it all, that I could actually lead a divine life. And I remember that thought at different times just appearing to me crystal clear and me seeing it. And then a year would go by, or 2 or 3 years would go by, and it would reemerge. And it wasn't until I was however old I was in 2001, I was about 41 years old, that in a moment it all exploded into all the best parts of myself came together and presented them to me as a coherent self. And all that was false, wrong, and untrue presented it to me as ego. And I could see the clear black and white distinction between the sewage and the champagne, and realized that I had a choice to make, and that this was the outcome of all the work I'd ever done in my life, and that I couldn't put off the choice anymore. I had a choice to make, and if I chose not to do it, if I chose to let any more time go by, I would be a profound and utter hypocrite and couldn't face my family, my patients, or my students. And that this is something I had to do. And I realized that in order to do it, I was going to have to face a lot, and that there were a lot of structures I was going to overcome. And it just seemed overwhelming to me. And honestly, I would go running 7, 8, 9 miles through the woods with tears streaming through my eyes because I just was overwhelmed at what it was going to take to live with fidelity to this best part of myself. But I also knew that to make any other choice would be to be a hypocrite and to waste my entire incarnation, and that my inclination, that the part of me that had been reading Dharma when I was 13 intuited this and had been looking for it, and to give it up at 41 would have meant my whole life up to that point was a complete sham, total pretense, and that I would just have to live the rest of my life knowing I was a hypocrite. So the point here is, having said that, there is a leading edge to the unconscious, and that is the subconscious. And the subconscious impresses itself upon consciousness, and then we just suppress it back in and say, not yet, not yet, I need more time. Yet, all of that content we're aware of, and we're not shocked by it because we know it's true. So that's a distinction between what's unconscious and what's subconscious. In clinic, we can sense unconscious content for a patient, but we can never be sure of it. I can sense strongly, for instance, through pulse and really just sitting with a person, that they were sexually abused, that they were physically abused, that they were emotionally abused, or that they committed some egregious crime against another person. I can sense this. But I can have a fair degree of inclination toward what it is that was done to them or what they did, but I can't know. And I never out and out present to a person and would say and create meaning for them and say, I think you did this, I think you did that, because that is the domain of mostly charlatans, making up stories for people. I prefer and I trust that as we move chi and as we promote separation, as we promote communication, which is the end of repression and end of separation, that what needs to be revealed will be revealed. As it's revealed, we can open up to it. And I prefer to reveal this content and promote it through the asking of questions rather than the making of declarations. But with suppression, a person can start to say something and then immediately change the topic. Like they start to talk about something meaningful and then they say, oh, did I tell you what my cat did this morning? Oh, and then you can point out to the person, that's interesting. Did you see what just happened? And they'll answer somewhere on the continuum from, no, I didn't, quite hostilely, which means I did, but you are not allowed to go there, all the way up to, no, but I'm curious, what did you see happen? All the way to, yeah, I was talking about something and we started to go deep and it was meaningful and I immediately felt vulnerable and I shifted it away to my cat. Then you can say, well, would you like to talk about this? And look, and then the whole world can open up. And of course, the ego's terrified of this because the suppression is the leading edge the of just what's on the verge of consciousness. But to dip a toe in those waters opens up into the whole thing. Patients can be unconscious of their motives in relationship to their suppression into the subconscious, but they'll always know the content. So the person with the cotton pulse, cotton is like an amorphous quality that obscures direct contact with the artery. and the edges of the pulse and having the pulse have a distinct form. And implicates deep resignation and sadness over deep disappointment, to the point that it's a +5 early in life. And it implicates some significant growth in the body between the age of 4 and 70. And relative to this, it's never unconscious content. The person always know, if you say, did you have a major disappointment in life that led to deep sadness and resignation, they'll be able to say, when I was 5, my grandmother died. When I was, 6, my dog died. My brother died. My parents were divorced. Whatever it is, they know what happened. They're not unaware of what happened. So unconscious content we may sense, but we can't know as practitioners. But the dynamics of suppression into the subconscious and the emergence from the subconscious into consciousness and subsequent dynamics of suppression around it, we can see that in real time and work with it. So we can help catalyze its emergence to reveal greater depth, but the patient has to be willing, and we can make suggestions with care and love and do pointing out, but some people will explicitly say, or metaphorically and subtly say, we're not going there, which, what they're saying is, don't you fucking touch me. Back the fuck off. Get the fuck away from me. And that puts us in conflict with the patient, because patients essentially want to feel better without having to change. Most patients. And it's a relatively rare person who comes to us appreciating the degree of depth we can work with them at, who's coming to us because they want to work in a way to uncover subtle dimensions of self and resolve shadow and really take themselves on. And let's face it, very few practitioners are capable of this sort of work, so there's no reasonable expectation that the public would be aware of it. And most of the public isn't, 30% or so in the country of people in the country are still at a pre-personal stage of development. 30 to 40% are still stuck at stages of development really in the first 4 chakras, or riveted by gross stasis in these early stages, so that even though they have window dressing of later stages and even some manifestation of potentials and capacities at later stages, these are very far from being fully embodied and held in consciousness and enacted in the world by gross pathologies and distortions at earlier stages of development. We'll talk briefly about the difference between suppression, repression, and sublimation. I really went through suppression and repression. Suppression is the conscious inhibition of unacceptable memories, impulses, and desires. Suppression relegates this content to the subconscious, and we play whack-a-mole with it. So this content starts bringing itself, no, I'm not looking at that now. No, I'm not looking at that now. I'm going to eat. No, I'm not looking at that now. I'll have a cigarette. No, I'm not looking at that now. I'll masturbate. I'll have sex. I'll eat a cookie. It would be good time. Hey, honey, why don't we watch that new Netflix series? But we see the content, and in terms of IFS, internal family systems therapy, the firefighters come in and immediately say, no, not going there. Let's engage in this behavior. When we go to a practitioner and we say, well, I want to overcome my drinking. I want to overcome my smoking. I want to come over my eating, overcome my pornography addiction, my gambling, whatever. I want to overcome this. I want to overcome it. But to overcome it, they make it all about the it, which is displacement, because what really needs to do is address everything that the engagement in the behavior itself is keeping from awareness. And we can start with the subconscious and working with that content because it's the frothy top of the unconscious. We can begin working with that. But, underneath that is the actually repressed, forgotten content that the person can have quite a violent reaction to and is doing all this hard work to keep from themselves because the repression of it is what allowed the self to the self small s ego to survive. So repression is an operation whereby the subject attempts to repel or confine to the unconscious representations, thoughts, images, memories, which are bound to some basic instinct. And to satisfy that instinct, which would be pleasurable to do, would run the risk of provoking displeasure because of other requirements in culture. So this is really the psychoanalytic definition, which in other words, I would love to do XYZ in the world, and at a basic sort of like sexual oral stage, and according to the impulse, satisfying the impulses of the lower three chakras, it would be very pleasurable to do that. But if I did that, I might lose my job, might lose my relationship, I might lose the respect of my children, I might lose the standing in my mythic membership community. And so I have to work to repress and shove that away. And to act on it would have consequences. Now, it's really the same thing with if I were to recall the sexual abuse that happened to me, or if I were to remember what I did to someone or what was done to me, if that was to come into consciousness, it would so challenge my view of who I am that I would have to take responsibility for communication to others. I would have to take it on and cease being a victim of it. I might have to take responsibility to others for things I had done in the past, and that would change my relationship and the way I think about myself and the way others would think about me, and that could have consequences, and I'm not willing to do this. So all this work is being done, and it's always done one way or another to keep me separate, superior, alone, better than, and isolated. And the net result of that is always to be a victim of forces beyond my control. And to the degree that I feel I'm a victim, I'm repressing the content, and a lot of that content are thoughts like early emotions, rage, lust, and then thoughts. And to really work with all of this, I would have to cease being a victim and understand that all the conclusions I drew, as true as they may be, are very, very partial. And I might have to apologize and I might have to forgive. And I might have to, even worse, take responsibility for whatever role I played in the whole thing. Now, it is true that when we are young, we're not responsible for what happened to us. But we are responsible, and we might not even responsible for things we did because we didn't know better. We literally didn't know better. But we may have done things at ages where we did know better and didn't have integrity to know better. And we also might have had things done to us where we actually played some degree of role in it, where we knew, even if it was for a moment, that we shouldn't have made a certain choice. And then we'd have to take responsibility, and taking responsibility means we'd have to give up being a victim. And even though we may have had no responsibility, we'd have to give up, we'd have to take full responsibility, not for what happened to us, but absolute responsibility for the consequences of what happened to us, for what we made of it. So lastly, so we have suppression, we have repression, and last is sublimation. Sublimation is alchemy. It's the conscious direction of lower impulses into higher aspirations. We sublimate lead into our alchemical decoction, and out of it comes gold. So a classic example of sublimation would be making the conscious choice. So when I had my initial awakening, one of the things that impressed itself on me in a moment was I walked out of the meditation hall and I looked at Emily and I spontaneously said, this was after 10 years of marriage. And I spontaneously said to her, you owe me nothing. You're free and I'm free. And I want to be celibate. And we were celibate for a year and a half. And I knew that there had been no time since I hit puberty where I wasn't trying to get into a relationship, in a relationship, or trying to get out of a relationship. And I knew that what was hitting me now, that for the rest of my life, my primary relationship was going to be to this. And everything else was going to be built upon it. But my main relationship was going to be integrity to the wholesomeness that I was awakening to. And in order to do that, I needed to be celibate for an indeterminate amount of time because I was just still, 41 years old. And I knew I was just driven by still urges and hormones and all these structures around relationship and all these structures around sexuality. And I knew I needed to put those aside for the sake of really being able to work with. So what I was awakening to, so that was a sublimation. I was ceasing repression, facing everything, avoiding nothing. And I didn't want to, I was meditating 2 hours a day. And I just wanted my practice to be the medicine without making it about anything else. And I knew this was the only way that Emily and I would ever have a chance to manifest the full potential of what we had seen when we first met each other. When we had one date and I went out the next morning, bought an engagement ring, and we had been together 10 years at that point. And we had seen this great potential, but I knew everything, there was painful separation. And I knew to take full responsibility for my part of it, that we needed to be celibate. And this was a shocking it came out of my mouth. And when I heard myself say it, I was stunned because I had never had that thought for an instant. And it was like a spontaneous emergence. So sublimation is the conscious, the cessation of repression on the one hand, but then the healthy choice not to enact basic reflexes, instincts, and impulses for the sake of channeling all those resources into a greater integration. And this is a basis of Tantra. And the teaching I'm giving is essentially a tantric teaching. There is a great and gross distortion of Tantra in Western culture, as culture cultures all over the world tend to distort all the esoteric and deep and true inner traditions of all the teachings into very gross marketable dimensions. It's not just Western culture, all cultures do it. TCM did it with Chinese medicine. So the thing is that one can enact the absolute depth of tantric teaching without sexual engagement. I mean, we're working with the sexual impulse, the creative impulse, the life force, eros. We're working with love. This is tantra. It's a tantric teaching. And there is a healthy place for repression, but the healthy face of repression is really sublimation, which in the way I'm using the term is always a conscious choice to channel the resources and the urgency of the lower chakra manifestations into the flowering of higher capacities. So we talked about the pre-conscious. Oh no, we're talking about now pre-conscious. So pre-conscious is unrepressed. And it's just content beneath the level of consciousness, entering consciousness, but we're not playing whack-a-mole with it. It's when you think to yourself, oh, it's coming, it's right on the tip of my tongue. And you're not doing any work to hold it from yourself, but you don't have yet the words to fully articulate it. And it is something that if you make room for and invite, and then so the pre-conscious is conscious is like when I'm engaged in a synthesis and I'm at the typewriter, the Mac, not typewriter anymore, but the computer, and I can't articulate it. I can't articulate it. So I provide an invitation and I go away and it starts to present itself. And sometimes I wake up in the middle of the night and I have to run downstairs and the whole thing is presenting itself. And I can feel that it's imminent, but I don't quite have the words, but it's feeding itself to me and I'm articulating it as it's coming. And that's the pre-conscious. So it's beneath the level of immediate conscious, between consciousness and the unconscious, but no work is being done at all to repress it. Tip of the tongue feeling. Hello, my friends. There's probably a little jump in the audio and video because I pause these now and then. So here I am back. So we're going to look at endocepts, which are typical of the emergence of human consciousness and the human mind, I should say, the human mind, congruent with the emergence of language. So endocepts precede concepts, and they are a condensation of impulse, emotion, feeling, and sensation. They occur when the mind is incipient with language. This is the age at which a child is kind of frustrated and something's on the tip of its tongue. And it wants something, but it doesn't quite have the words. And the parents or the adults say, use your words, use the words. And the child keeps going, this, this, this. And they don't quite have the language to articulate, I want a carrot. So they're going, and making a gesture. And they're kind of frustrated and then they know inside they have a mental image of what they want, but they don't have the signifier for it yet, or can't pronounce the signifier in a way that it's understood. So these are endocepts. They're the basis of empathy and artistic talent. With empathy, you're with someone and you may not be able to exactly articulate their experience, but you can feel their experience. And it's the same thing with artistic talent, is this sense of imminence and bringing something into form and not quite having the words. And you and I might be standing, walking through the Met, and we come to a particularly beautiful painting and we stop. And I say, wow, you're really transfixed by this. And you go, yeah, it's really, it's, and I mean, you can say beautiful or powerful, but those don't capture it. There's something you're trying to articulate. Endoceptual awareness typifies a person can get frozen in it in a sense of under pressure or in relationship to relatively low impulses, instincts, and reflexes and urges. The person doesn't, they regress to an earlier view and they don't quite have the language to talk about what it is they're experiencing. They break eye contact, they look at the floor, they shift their eyes around, they giggle. The person seems immature and filled with emotion, but they can't quite express what they're feeling in words. And this often has to do with early uh, trauma that happened pre-language or prior to the formation of language, or just congruent with the formation of language. In this kind of instance, often body-oriented psychotherapies, primal scream therapies, rebirthing, reliving the birth experience. Um, Rebirthing is like hyperventilating and being told you're going through the birth canal and to go through that trauma. Primal scream, where a person's just taking a baseball bat and beating pillows and shrieking, don't you effing touch me, get away from me. And therapies that take people into regressive states, often with a deep emphasis on releasing trauma from the physical body. So again, it's important. And that kind of therapy can be helpful. The problem is it's helpful, particularly helpful for a specific demographic of people. Many people could benefit from a little bit of it, but what happens is people who really are at much higher stages of development, like postmodern people, might have to do some of that therapy, but that people tend to get transfixed by it, stuck in it, stuck in the Bardo realm of it, and just do it over and over and over and over again, when really a little bit of it would be good, and then moving on. And actually, they're at a much higher level of development where they can really begin looking into complex dynamics and having cognitive awareness of things, making the subject the object, taking responsibility, making choices, this, this, this sort of thing. So typical of endosepsic patients is when they're discussing material, their eyes start to flutter. They look down and stare at the ground, which is kind of a metaphor for regression into the unconscious. They feel shame, they start flushing, and they sort of collapse into a pre-rational state. They're literally, in a sense, decompensating in front of you. Not in the sense that you're going to get on the phone and dial 911, but in the sense that this person might function well in their career and meet their obligations, but when it comes to starting to deal with their history and their past or certain difficult things, you can see that they're regressing to really, they start to look childish. They can even get sometimes this look in their eye that children get when they know they're jacking you around and they know they're lying to you, and they can get a little devilish playful, devilish look that shows you they know they're screwing around, but they're sort of amused by it. So there's a case study in Deepening Perspectives on a woman named DG on page 695, and I talk all about endoceps. And if you look at the footnotes in that, it'll reference the origin of it in the psychoanalytic literature if you want to look at primary sources. So this brings us to the conclusion of the section on the unconscious. The unconscious, we want to establish creative relationship to the unconscious. We want to cease repression, and we cease repression by being at a developmental stage where we can take responsibility for, are willing to take responsibility for ourselves, give up being a victim, and arrive at a place in our life where we're done repressing, we're done creating karma, and we're ready to put a freely made choice as the foundation and the root of our own development. And we're willing to look ourselves in the eyes, admit what we know to ourselves, admit what we know to each other, and begin to coalesce the very best, the deepest, the highest, the best part of ourselves with the most pure motive into a single, whole, unified self, as opposed to just having it show up here and having it show up there and in this part and in that part and when I'm doing this and when I'm doing that. Literally to step into that and begin to live life from that and as it. And we can ask ourselves often in relationship to any dharma, and I'm applying it specifically to the teachings I'm giving. Is this real? Is this real? And we can have be inspired by it, and we can have insights, but in moments we can question, and being skeptical is good because we want to subject any view. We want to become doubtless about any view, and we can only do that through inquiry and putting things on the table and looking at it. But we come to a place where we stop asking ourselves, is this Dharma real? And we start realizing it's only real to the extent I make it real by living it in the world and manifesting it through myself in real time. So putting our stake in the ground to cease repression for the sake of freedom and the sake of wholeness and integrity, we decide that we're going to have a fully lived relationship to the unconscious. We know we're always going to have an unconscious. Having a free, easy, and unrepressed relationship and co-collaboration with the unconscious doesn't mean you cease to have an unconscious. It just means you're no longer repressing it, and it's an engaged partner. And the invitation to it is, I'm ready to see anything I have to see. I'm ready to know anything I have to know. I am not intimidated by anything that might be revealed, and whatever is revealed, I will respond to it from the pure motive to catalyze the emergence of the true and the good and the beautiful for all, for the best of all, for the well-being of all. And I'm not afraid of anything that comes, and I won't repress you anymore. You have my attentive ear. I will listen with love and interest, and whatever comes up, we go forward together. And this, in a way, is the like American Indian metaphor of walking side by side with death. Because to the ego, the unconscious is death. So rather than being stuck in the ego, the fiction of a self that is separate, we are now walking side by side with this ceaseless, infinitely deep, living mystery the womb of all emergence, and the creative force that catalyzes the emergence from that womb, from being into becoming. And we are rooted in being, and we are the vehicles for becoming. So we begin to trust the process. We begin to listen, and that listening catalyzes the rectification of the heart-kidney axis, which gives rise to an ever-developing deep intuition. It gives rise to humility because we have to live with at least one knee bent, which means we're always interested in what we don't know. And we're always a little more interested in what we don't know than in what we do know. And that interest is spirit. And by bending the knee to become more interested in what we don't know than in what we do know, we need to live with humility, and the unknown becomes a friend, and the mind no longer goes crazy in the face of the unknown. And if the mind does start going crazy in the face of the unknown, it does it as an object in awareness that we can take a relatively objective view of. We feel more ease, more space, more trust. We develop soul depth because a relationship to the unknown. The soul in the way is a subtle portal to the unknown. The ego is the known. The ego is everything that's known. And much of what is known as ego is false, wrong, and untrue. And it's just belief. But by making room within ourselves for the creative contribution of the unconscious and giving ourselves to that, we develop faith in the goodness of the process, faith in the ceaseless and endless creativity of the void. And through this faith, we develop a soul depth and the capacity to listen from a depth way beyond just ourselves, from a collective depth. We gain access to, through our individual soul, to the one soul, the one subtle realm, which is the portal between light and love and physical manifestation. And we gain the capacity to act on a pure motivation. You know when you know when you know. And when we know, we decrease the time between realization and response, and we begin acting in the world with integrity to the voice of conscience that speaks to us through soul. And the more spontaneously we enact the soul's life curriculum with faith, the more spiritual self-confidence we develop, and the more soul depth we develop. So sort of the punchline here is that the unconscious is infinitely deep, and no matter how wise we become and insightful we become, humility always accompanies wisdom, because all the virtues are holographic and we only have one to the degree we have all of them. You can't be wise without, you can't have a lot of great wisdom but lack humility. Wisdom is born of humility. The humility to surrender the ego for the sake of access to a great depth beyond the mind. So while the unconscious is infinitely deep and we're always going to have an unconscious, it is also true that we all tend to know a lot more about what we're doing and why than we're willing to admit to ourselves and others, because the ego doesn't want to admit what we know to ourselves, because then we'd have to act on it and there'd be consequences. And it doesn't want to admit what we know to others, because then they will have higher expectations of us and the ego will be on the hook. And the ego's position is never wanting to be on the hook. Nobody tells me what to do. I'm in this for myself. And the position of the soul is the realization that we're on the hook because we didn't have to come back. And we agreed to come back for the privilege of being the vehicle for the alleviation of the suffering of others and the vehicle through which others awaken. That it's our job. And that we're on the hook to live this and make these teachings real because it's a matter of personal integrity. And to not do it, at least in my realization, to not do it would make me a hypocrite, which means I could never make rightful eye contact with anyone again. so, well, we always have an unconscious, and we're always learning, trying to make this, cultivating to make the subject an object. We all know a lot more right here and right now about what we're doing and why we're doing it. So the path means taking responsibility for that. And we also have to acknowledge that consciousness is always conscious. And one of the phases of waking up is the realization of, oh my God, when we wake up to the witness, we realize, you really gasp, I've always known what I was doing and why. And I asked, and this is true. And then I asked the question in my book is, does the fact that we awaken to see that we've always known what we were doing and why mean that we always did know what we were doing and why? And my conclusion is it does not mean that. It's just when we wake up and we're looking through the eyes of the witness, through the eyes of consciousness itself, we see no repression, we see no hesitancy. And as the ego momentarily drops into the rear view mirror as we look through the eyes of consciousness itself, all we see is awareness and consciousness. And through those eyes, we realize consciousness has always been here. Some part of me has always been conscious, and that part of me always knew, and that is true. But that is just a perspective. And there are many perspectives that we look through. And early in life, for most of us, we are not looking through the eyes of the witness consciousness. To the degree we're looking through consciousness and that we are conscious, we are looking through age-old conditioned structures that significantly twist and distort our views. So here is the homework. Please read all of this in Deepening Perspectives. Here are your contemplations. What is my experience of being more interested in what I don't know than in what I do know? What is my experience of initiating a creative partnership with my unconscious, sincerely declaring to it and to all the forces that be, to ultimacy itself, that right here, right now, I'm ready to stop being a seeker. I'm ready to become a finder, and I'm ready to receive anything that needs to be revealed to me. And you have my ear, you have my heart, you have all my attention. I will not look away. I will not turn away, and whatever comes, I will act on for the sake of the highest. Please notice how often your mind takes the position there's a problem. And what happens when you let go of knowing how things are and what they mean, and open to and invite the unconscious and listen out of interest. So when you come to a place, I want you to compare what it's like to just look at life and just see a problem this sense of existential problem, which is the ego's view, that makes it feel separate and victimized. And instead, I want you to step back and experience what is it like to let go of the notion that anything in your life, your sexual abuse, the fact that your parents got divorced, that you were cheated, that this was done, that that was whatever, to let go of any notion that it's a problem, that it's in the way whatsoever. And I want you to see what it's like to let the unconscious know, I'm ready to deal with this. I'm ready to take responsibility for being free. I'm ready to be free, and I'm ready to see anything I have to see and do anything I have to do for the sake of resolving this so I can go forward. And it's not going to take too much time. I'm going to do this now. And how did the two experiences differ? I had a woman who was talking to me in a class recently, and she said, Lonnie, what you're saying is very beautiful, and I'm really touched by your lecture, but I have this disease and I'm on 16 different medications. And I've been on them since I'm little. And I just feel it's really in the way of me being able to live to give myself and progress spiritually in the way other people could. And I said to her, well, that's one way of looking at it. And certainly there's a significant degree of suffering you're experienced that most of us will never experience. And by your presence here, and by the fact of your engagement, by the smile on your face, and by the fact of you that the part of you that is touched by what I'm saying and able to receive it in a way that you could be touched by it and engage in this way, suggests that the notion that any of it is in the way is just a thought. And that thought doesn't have merit, that actually nothing's in the way. And it may be that your contribution is in the face of everything you're living with, to destroy everybody else's cynicism and victimization about their own special reasons for not living this, by being a shining living example of the light and the goodness and the love that's in your heart in spite of everything, in a way that would just destroy anybody else's cynicism about the possibility they could do it too. And this was it was a very beautiful moment, I thought, and the essence of really what my teaching is, made non-abstract and emerging in real time in this class. And it was just very moving, and everybody got very quiet because there was the Dharma right there. And she was just so moved and so beautifully touched by what I said. And what I said wasn't just some hallmarkish kind of thing. It was real. It was true, and it rang real, and it rang true, and it shifted things. So I would like you to be mindful when you're when you're suppressing content. I want you to consider, what content do you play whack-a-mole with? What are the 1, 2, 5, 10 things, 20 things that keep popping up that you should stop doing or start doing? And just make a list with them. Just make a list of all these things. Some of them may just come once every 3 or 4 or 5 or 8 years and then fade back into the mist, and make a list of them and start doing them. Take them all on, and just, that's the field to clear. And you stop playing whack-a-mole with it. What content do you lie to yourself about being unconscious about? That's the stuff that you just suppress into the subconscious, but you know about it, but you make like you don't know about it. It's the stuff you tell yourself you need more time to do. The fact that you're telling yourself you need more time to do it and then forget for another year or 5 years means that it's not truly unconscious. So you begin working with all the subconscious stuff and noticing when stuff emerges that you immediately start suppressing. And what happens if you breathe, step back, and just sit with it? And what would be the consequences in your lives and the lives of others if you addressed it? Mostly, I want you to just start to really consider what it would mean to start to make friends with your unconscious. In psychoanalytic terms of Eric Neumann, for the men and the women here and every other gender, if we look at the unconscious as matriarchy and the feminine, and consciousness as patriarchy and the masculine, what we're doing is looking for an integration and a transcendence, an integration of the feminine, the masculine, yin and yang, matriarchy and patriarchy, and a transcendence of them into a new form of consciousness that goes beyond matriarchy and patriarchy, into a whole new form of consciousness. And it does not necessarily look at all like what is being born in the LGBTQ movement at this moment. It is imminent. It is just imminent. And if we look into that kind of movement, there's often still a kind of binary, a kind of binary. People changing physical genders and acting like what they think the other gender acts like or how the other gender dresses. And I'm talking about distinctions that go beyond, it's like when we talk about God and we say, well, we don't believe in God. Well, the God we don't believe in is a white guy with a beard who lives on a cloud. And it's sort of the same thing as we're looking to transform into a form of consciousness that we don't necessarily have language for, because all of the reference to it come from earlier stages of human development. So we're looking for a new language, and it's interesting that Aurobindo and Jean Gebser, who coined the term integral, had to start coining their own terms and start creating. I mean, Gebser is a beautiful example. Start making up words to describe the states of consciousness that he was experiencing and the stage of development that he was describing. And so in this way, we're sort of in an intersexual phase of development. And it's in the sense of there's a whole new consciousness coming in, and we're creating it. We're the vehicles for this. And it doesn't look like anything from most of the books in the 1960s and the 1970s or through the 80s, 90s, or 2000s, all the self-help books. I'm pointing to something which is imminent and being born. And it's exciting because we're all part of that. And we're doing this together. We're all doing this together. And it's something that can only be done collectively. And it isn't a commune where everyone has a job and everyone recycles. It isn't that sort of thing. It's a whole nother order. Okay, well, thank you all. And I speak a little about it in the earliest pages. In the first page or two of my clinical practice book, I talk about it a little. And how I'm talking about it there, that was written in the midst of an awakening when I barely had language for any of it, but I think the spirit's there. Okay, I'll see you all on the call. Thank you so much.